10 years ago, all eyes were on the Japanese. In the race for world economic leadership, they seemed headed for victory. The Japanese were proud of the growth they'd achieved so quickly.
Japan was the most productive country in the world, and the Japanese were the most industrious people. We felt we'd finally caught up with America.
A whole country was said to share the same discipline and rigor, the same values. In northern Japan, even the local racehorses were expected to drag heavy loads over obstacles on their way to victory.
I thought the Japanese were invincible. They seemed to be doing everything right, and they seemed to have so much money to make investments that they would be unstoppable.
But the relentless advance was about to falter. In the 1990s, Japan was brought down by a severe recession. The burst of Japan's economic bubble destroyed savings and cost millions their jobs. Now the Japanese are trying to work out what went wrong and how to put it right.
Please. 5 million, 5,500,000.
At the height of the boom in the late 1980s, there seemed nothing to which the Japanese couldn't aspire.
7 million, 500,000.
They were suddenly so rich and their country so strong that the best the world had to offer seemed cheap.
14,500,000 pounds.
Impressionists and European masters were bid up to new heights.
500,000. The last 15 million now.
Japanese companies were spending billions on foreign investments.
ロサンゼルスの中心部の高層ビルはほとんどが日本の所有である。
To Americans whose national icons fell into Japanese hands, it seemed like a takeover, from Manhattan to Hollywood.
コロンビア買収に関してソニーは FTC
The Japanese had a new confidence, even arrogance.
私は非常に気持ちが良かったですね。西欧の
I felt great about it. I thought it was the East's revenge on Western capitalism. If it comes to it, I thought, we should buy all of the United States.
アメリカ全部買ってしまえばいいんじゃないかぐらいに思ってました。
We really should have bought more of America.
だったんだろうと僕は思ってます。
Now Van Gogh's sunflowers were heading for Tokyo too.
22,500,000 pounds for the last time.
What no one realized then was that the boom was false, a flimsy bubble blown up by cheap money and loose lending. It was to lead to one of the most devastating financial crashes of the century, with effects far beyond Japan. Now the search is on for the men who allowed it to happen, the very businessmen and bureaucrats Japan once trusted most. The series of wrong turnings and misjudgments which ended the Japanese miracle began in the early 1980s. Japan's manufacturers were so successful that they were pouring cars and televisions, bikes and cameras into the United States. With their jobs going, Americans wanted to strike back.
America is up in arms, Mr. Speaker, and it would be a mistake to underestimate our frustrations. Unless this warning is heeded, retaliation and possibly full-blown trade warfare lie just around the corner.
Finally, the Japanese gave in. At a meeting in New York's Plaza Hotel in 1985, they agreed to handicap their own exporters by engineering a stronger yen. Toyo Gyoten was a negotiator for the Japanese government.
The Plaza Accord was a kind of agreement which accomplished much more than everybody expected for the meeting. When we went to Plaza meeting, we are quite prepared to see substantial increase in yen's value.
The main point of the agreement was that the value of the Japanese yen should go up and the dollar down, so Japan's exports to the US wouldn't be so cheap. But the yen rose far faster than anyone expected, and Japanese officials grew alarmed.
After the Plaza Accord, the yen shot up, and the age of high yen recession came. Our exports suffered, and people worried it might be an even more serious situation than the oil shock. Many feared the Japanese economy was under threat again.
Fearing a recession, the bureaucrats made the first in a series of misjudgments. They eased credit restrictions and they slashed interest rates. From 5%, they reduced the cost of borrowing with a succession of cuts, until interest rates were the lowest in the world at 2.5%, and held them there. The idea was to help manufacturers and get more spending in the shops, but the money went elsewhere. Borrowing at cheap rates, investors poured cash into the property market, and land prices started to soar. In overcrowded Tokyo, land was scarce. Values were driven even higher when a government report said that the city would need still more office space as it strove to become a world financial center. Soon a land mania set in. Speculators fought for sites to develop. This patch of land used to be home to 15 families. Manabu Miyazaki was the middleman who persuaded them to sell, so the whole block of land could be put together.
This site has soaked up so much money. We worked it out at the time in the bubble years that as a piece of real estate, Japan was worth the whole of the United States 7 times over. There used to be a little coffee shop round the corner. Every morning, local people used to gather there and talked about when to sell the land they owned. Everyone was very excited in those days.
The Japanese thought land was the safest and most secure of all investments. Better than gold. Land prices had never gone down, could never go down.
It created so many deals and took so much cash in. Just tap here. You may hear banknotes.
Susumu Saito heard them calling too and joined the land rush. By turning over property quickly, he became a multi-millionaire.
I wasn't buying and selling as much as some others, but I had annual sales of 4 billion in those days. For instance, I put one site on the market at 1.5 million yen per square meter. It was sold on through many other agents and eventually went for 10 times as much. I was worth 18 billion at the peak time.
As prices rippled out from Tokyo, farmers and smallholders became millionaires too, at least on paper. 60% of Japanese owned their own homes, and they felt richer than ever before. Two passions, for land and for golf, came together in a great golf club boom. Club memberships were priced according to the land value of the course and were bought and sold just like shares.
My father became a member of this course 40 years ago, and it then cost 800,000 yen.
当時の80万円は大変な金額だったかもしれませんが
800,000 was a lot of money at the time, of course, but it went up to 200 million at the peak of the bubble. A huge difference. I doubt if anyone was prepared to pay that sort of money just because he wanted to play golf here.
Persuasive developers like Suemitsu Ito had no difficulty borrowing huge sums from the banks to build brand new golf courses. His first one cost £100 million.
Memberships for new courses sold like hotcakes in those days. It was no problem to sell memberships. Even if you spent 20 billion, which was what I invested in mine, it was easy to get it back. It's not true now, but back then, 20 billion felt like 2 billion, or even just 200 million. The actual value of money felt so small.
This is 100 million in cash. Quite heavy.
Golf brokers worked like stockbrokers, but the memberships they traded were often bought and sold with cash.
When 100 million was normal for a club membership, you became numb with money. I used to get on the train and just chuck my briefcase with 10 million cash in it on the luggage rack. Unthinkable now. Back then, I had sales over $1 billion, maybe twice a week. We were dealing in unbelievable amounts. I think there were more than 20 golf courses with membership values over 100 million.
The exhilaration was shared by all ages.
They're far from the Western stereotype of the fanatical, hard-working Japanese, but the young people at this fun fair are behind a consumer revolution which is changing the face of Japan's economy.
Young Japanese were the first generation to grow up in a society that believed it had at last caught up with the West, and if anything, was more affluent. Spending company money, businessmen entertained each other with new extravagance.
Say there were 5 of us going to a restaurant. It would cost anything up to 30 or 50,000 yen each. Then we'd go to Ginza to drink. We'd visit 2 or 3 different bars and spend about 100,000 at each bar. And with tips for waiters and hostesses, you'd pay 10 million for the whole evening quite easily.
Presiding over this euphoria was the respected and all-powerful Ministry of Finance. Its bureaucrats took much of the credit for the post-war miracle, and they still guided everything the banks and stockbrokers did with a mix of legal controls and personal connections. Officials here thought the rising wealth was real enough. Yoshimasa Nishimura had joined the ministry's elite ranks